Hi, this is Brad Wilcox, and I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Virginia and a senior fellow at the Institute for Family Studies. We are grateful to have you here today on our Zoom webinar with Lyman Stone. And I want to just to mention very quickly that our view of today's moment is that this global pandemic and the recession that is following in its wake will obviously profoundly reshape the meaning and practice of family life in the United States and across the globe. Now, one important dimension of COVID's fallout is its impact on fertility. And probably as many of you know, we reached a record low fertility rate last year in 2019 of about 1.72 babies per woman on average. And yet in the wake of this COVID quarantine, many Americans that I've spoken to are predicting a kind of baby boom 9 months from now as a consequence of so many couples being stuck at home. But Lyman Stone, a research fellow of the Institute for Family Studies, as you will see, has a very different view of what's going to happen in the coming months, in short sort of term years ahead when it comes to fertility. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Lyman to give you his perspective on the way in which this COVID-induced recession will affect fertility in the US going forward. So with that, Lyman, please go ahead and welcome.
Thank you, Brad. I'm going to share my screen here, my presentation. And okay, so hopefully everyone can see the screen I'm sharing. I know that we have an hour allotted here. I have about 40 slides that I'm going to try and do in about 30 to 35 minutes so that we have plenty of time for questions, because I know people will have a lot of questions, but that is to say that I'm going to move through a lot of material pretty quickly. So I'll go ahead and tell you my big takeaway is, as Brad said, that I think there will not be a wave of corona babies. In fact, I think 9 months from now, we're going to actually see less births. And my intention is to prove that to you by burying the opposition in an avalanche of charts and graphs. Now, before I get into this, I do want to mention, obviously what we're talking about is a moment of crisis for the country on the whole, for the world, and particularly for families and communities hit hard by COVID very close to home. So if I should happen to refer to a graph of say hurricane deaths as fun or interesting, I hope you will forgive that that is a stats junkie enjoying his color-coded graphs, not a making light of what's a very serious topic. But with that, let's get in. So we have this question: how could a catastrophe impact births? COVID, an epidemic, is a kind of catastrophe, but we're going to talk about a lot of different types of catastrophes today. We'll talk about hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis. I haven't got any volcanic eruptions, but I have a lot of epidemics, a few famines, lots of different bad things that happen to humans. So how might a catastrophe impact births? So there's a number of potential pronatal forces that might apply in a case like COVID, things that could make people have more babies. One is that couples might spend more time together with nothing to do. Of course, there is something to do. Another possibility is it's the end of the world, baby. We might as well, you know, hey, if we're going to die tomorrow, then what's the problem? Another possibility is what we call recuperative or mortality replacement fertility. This is the idea that when a lot of people die in a society, we sometimes see a sense that people, they're not really directly replacing those who are dead, but they are responding to their deaths. So you get babies born after a high mortality event are often named after family members who died, right? And so you could get this sort of sense of, well, all these people died, it needs to be for a reason, so let's make life. It could also be that parents cooped up with their children rediscover that they love spending time with their kids, and so they decide to have more. And there's also other possible social changes. It could be that society adopts more widespread teleworking, and so that leads to more family-friendly, a more family-friendly post-COVID world. So those are your kind of potential pronatal forces. Then you have your potential antinatal forces, and this list is longer. And one force is just that a lot of people die. And some of them will happen to have been reproductive age women, and particularly women who may have already been pregnant. So maternal mortality is one force that will reduce births 9 months from now. Some of those potential mothers will die. Another is spousal death. This is a widely demonstrated thing in epidemics, is that spouses die, and that impacts the fertility odds of the other spouse, both in the short and the long run. Another is that sick people have sex less. And furthermore, that being feverish tends to reduce the viability of sperm. So it reduces odds of conception. High fevers also increase miscarriage risks. That's true for COVID and any other. We do have extensive research from SARS and from MERS showing higher rates of adverse pregnancy outcomes. In a recent study out of China looking at, I think it was 50-something pregnancies, found a much higher rate of preterm birth, which if we see higher preterm birth, that also probably means lower birth weight and more miscarriage. Single people during a quarantine will have greatly reduced sexual opportunities. So this is kind of the flip side of couples stuck together, is single people stuck alone. As Brad mentioned, economic uncertainty. What's going to happen after COVID? Now, that economic uncertainty is rapidly turning into economic certainty. That is, we know what will happen. Unemployment, economic loss. And economic loss is not pronatal. And finally, there's always the possibility that parents will not rediscover the joy of children, that they will in fact rediscover the screaming loudness of children, right? So these are all these potential antinatal forces. So which set of forces will win? I obviously think that the antinatal forces are going to win, at least in the short run. So what I've done here is I've collected every month of birth and death data for 5 countries across as far back as we have them. This adds up to about 5,500 months of birth and death data. And I've taken every month, how much did deaths increase in that month versus the same month a year earlier? And then how much did births increase 9 months later versus their own sort of same season period? And we just say, okay, are big death spikes, so times when deaths rise by a lot, are they actually associated with fewer births 9 months later? And in all five countries, you can see that they are. So when deaths fall, so this is minus 20%, when we get big declines in deaths, births rise. This is change in births 7 to 10 months later. So when there's fewer death, there's more birth 9 months later. And then at this far other end, we see that when there's more death, there are fewer births. And in the interim, there are, of course, these bumpy periods, but in the interim, generally, we see at each stage between here that even at fairly modest changes, say from minus 5% to plus 5%, it actually does look like more deaths leads to less births. So this is a pretty robust relationship demonstrated across a very large number of events where I haven't cherry-picked anything here. I've just taken the entire available universe of data for these 5 countries for which we have a very long period of data. Now they are all European countries. It might be that it would be different in a different context, but at the same time, they're the data that we have. So then we get to specific events. Each of these dots, and I know this kind of looks like a crazy person with all of their Post-it notes on the wall and running their like strands between them, but each of these dots is a specific high mortality event. A hurricane, an epidemic, something like that, a heat wave. So over here is how much the percentage increase in monthly death rates associated with that mortality event. And over here is 9 months later, how much did births change? And what you can see is the correlation is negative, right? More death, less birth. So over here we have like the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami in Sri Lanka and in the Aceh province of Indonesia. You can see that was bad for births in the short run. Here we have the Fukushima incident, earthquake, tsunami, meltdown, like the trifecta of disaster. This is the Fukushima prefecture right here, and this is Iwate and Miyagi, two other smaller prefectures that were heavily affected. Here we have Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Maria. We've got the 2011 Joplin tornado. There's also some Alabama tornadoes here. These purple ones are major historic flu seasons in Finland. These red ones are US states during the 1918 flu pandemic. These blue ones are neutral countries, so not involved in World War I countries during the 1918 flu pandemic. This right here is the 1868 Finland famine. You heard me right, 1868. So lots of these interesting events, right? And again, the correlation seems to be negative. With no other control variables and just picking very crudely 9 months later, we already can explain 35% of the variation in changes in births simply by getting deaths. So that's pretty nice. And if we restrict to just epidemics, so if we throw out all the earthquakes and tsunamis, which those events tend to be very idiosyncratic, right? Earthquakes and tsunamis and these kinds of things they have very hard to predict effects because they're very specific events. They have very discrete impacts. Epidemics that have more general impacts, we do get some variation out on the extreme end, but this correlation is pretty tight. And so we can explain 56% of the variation in post-epidemic fertility, which that's this change here, simply by looking at change in deaths. That's this. So, are we going to see corona babies in 9 months after COVID? No, we're not. It's not going to happen. There's absolutely no precedent anywhere in any empirical evidence of a 9 month later baby boom for high mortality events. Okay, so I think that point hopefully is proved. But what about corona-ish babies? Like maybe not 9 months, but what about 13 months later or 18 months later? What about that? Well, for that, we want to look in more detail at some of these events. So my answer is a firm maybe. So let's see why I say maybe instead of yes or no. So here I've got some of these events and I've got the whole series of births. Now don't worry, you don't need to like memorize this chart. I'm going to go in more detail. So we've got like SARS in Hong Kong and the 1918 Finland flu plus Civil War, Hurricane Katrina, the Fukushima disaster, all these things. But the one I want to focus on in this moment is the 1918 flu in Massachusetts. Now, the 1918 flu came in 2 waves. The first wave, which had lower deaths, actually occurred back here. This black line, by the way, is the bad thing happening. This is when the really bad thing happens, and then these are months since the bad thing happening. So actually, Massachusetts had like a less bad thing happen back here, and then it had a really bad thing happen here at the 0. So what you can see is here, births fell a little bit. This was a response to the first wave of flu. And then here, 9 months after the really bad thing happening, you get a big decline in births. In Massachusetts, births never recover. They never fully recover, at least not on this time scale. Now, there are cases where births recover. So this blue line here, this is Switzerland during the 1918 flu. And you can see it does recover. It recovers in rare form. So there are cases of recovery. This red line here, by the way, is Hurricane Harvey in Houston. This is the Houston area. So sometimes there are recoveries, but we definitely see these big losses in the near term. In the long run, looks a little ambiguous. So we can zoom in on a few events. Here I'm looking at, this is Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. This is Hurricane Katrina in southern Louisiana. And this is the Fukushima disaster in Fukushima. So what we can see in both Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Maria is a migration response, right? Births fall immediately, which suggests a lot of people just left. However, this is not only a migration response. Academic research shows that this is also a miscarriage response. That is, rates of abortion and miscarriage rose after these disasters in the short run, because simply health systems were overrun, people didn't have good care, and the stress induced a lot of miscarriage. So that's that. But we definitely don't see like a recovery in the long run. So Hurricane Katrina, there's no recovery. Hurricane Maria, there's not a recovery. I mean, there's a little recovery here, but that's seasonal, and then we're back down. Fukushima, at 9 months, it's sort of churning along. There's not a big migration response, and then down we go, right? Down we go at the 9 months. And then it kind of churns along. We do kind of eventually recover, but it takes a long time. Then we can look at, these ones are kind of your deep cuts, like your B side for the real nerds here. This is the 2011 Joplin tornado hitting this Jasper County, Missouri births. You can see this is 9 months after the tornado. There's this little dip. Now on here, it doesn't look super impressive, right? Because this is a very volatile series. But when you account for seasonality, this is actually a pretty considerable dip. And then here, this is the one, the 2009 American Samoa tsunami. You know, did anyone here, were you aware that in 2009, American Samoa was hit by a tsunami? Well, it was. It caused a few dozen deaths. And a few dozen deaths in American Samoa is actually a very large number of deaths above normal. And the result was 9 months later. And then for 9 months after that, births were anomalously low. Right? So in large areas and small areas across a huge number of different types of events, we see the same thing. And of course, American Samoa, kind of have this, you do get some birth replacement out here, but then, you know, you don't get a full recovery to the pre-trend. Okay, so that was an absolute level. This noisy chart, though, standardizes all of this. So I take these, and I'm just looking at the percentage change from seasonal expectations. So again, the black line is when the bad thing happens, and then out here is the actual changes over time in each thing. The gray lines you don't need to pay too much attention to. The red line is the important thing. This is the average effect. And what you can see is for most of the period, it's close to zero. That in the long run, catastrophes don't have a clear impact on births. Maybe it's a little bit low, but we definitely see a lot of events above the line. But in the short run, there's a considerable effect, right? And particularly right at 9 months is when we hit the low ebb. Some places come a little earlier, some later, but on average, 9 months after a catastrophic event, we see a big decline in births. Okay, about for the average event in this series, right, there's about a 16% decline, but you know, it'd be different if I selected different events, but it'd be the same general pattern. Okay. So in the long run, though, again, we don't see any systematic change. Some places high, some places low. There's a lot of variation. So birth rates will mostly recover. We shouldn't have a strong expectation of some permanent change in birth rates. Full recovery is not certain. The average effect I've observed is a less than full recovery, but they'll mostly recover. But in the meantime, there won't be a boom 9 months from now. And if there is a boom, it's most likely to appear 17 to 23 months from now. That is well after the event, as people say, okay, the event is past, now we're gonna have the baby that we postponed during COVID, right? So they try to recover later on. The most likely period for that is something like June to November of 2021. And here I'm assuming that COVID will have burned out by the summer of 2020. If that assumption is wrong, then we're all in a lot of trouble. Okay, let's do some counter arguments. I know that this is very counterintuitive to a lot of people. We sort of have this narrative that of course a disaster is going to lead to a baby boom. You know, what are some counter arguments? And this one I've already marked as wrong, which I did not mean to do. So the question is, but H1N1 didn't cause a baby bust. So you can see I'm going to tell you that's wrong. So this is year-over-year change in monthly deaths in America. This is all causes of death. So big spikes mean a lot more people died at that time than in the year previous. So you can see here's H1N1. I have it marked. Wow, H1N1 was so bad. Not really. H1N1 is barely recognizable. It's barely a blip in the graph, right? Okay, sorry, I was just, I received a chat from someone in the group. I will share the presentation afterwards. I'll make it available for anyone who wants it. So H1N1 is barely a blip in the graph. It's greatly overrated as a crisis. You can see there's lots of other much bigger blips. So I've named a few of them. We have the terrible flu season that time forgot. We have the other terrible flu season. We have another bad flu. And then we have the mysterious death season. January of 2013 was a horrible time, apparently. Every cause of death rose. Traffic accidents rose, flu rose, heart attacks rose. I don't really have an explanation for that, which kind of makes it a bit harder to sleep at night. But the point is, this is what COVID will look like if we have 150,000 total deaths, which is about what CDC is forecasting, right? So all these death events, all these precedents that we have, they're nothing compared to what COVID will do in April if CDC's forecasts, which are on the more optimistic side, are correct, right? So I want to point out here that just this whole, well, H1N1, well, this flu, we have no living memory of this kind of event in America. And finally, H1N1 actually did cause a baby bust. So here we have change in flu deaths versus a year earlier, that's here on the x-axis, change in flu deaths. In here we have H1N1. These are flu seasons in the US over the last 15 years or so. You can see there's a pretty strong negative correlation, more flu, less babies, except for 2005. I don't really know what's going on with 2005, but it was a pretty moderate flu year anyways. But as you can see, H1N1 actually did lead to a bit of a baby bust. So worse flu, less babies, pretty simple equation. And I've prematurely marked this one as wrong too. Well, people said Zika was going to cause a baby bust too, and that wasn't true, right? We all heard how Zika and microcephaly and all these things was going to lead to less babies. But you might say, well, that's not true. That didn't happen. Wrong. Zika did lead to less babies. So here's US states by the number of positive Zika tests per 100,000 people. I put it on a log scale because I want you to notice every state in the US had less than 10 cases per 100,000 people, except Puerto Rico, where there were over 1,000 cases per 100,000 people. Over 1% of the population of Puerto Rico was infected with Zika. Now, because I have one extreme point out here, my R squared is pretty good. I can explain a reasonable amount of variation, but of course I'm cheating because I have one extreme point dragging that down. Now, a lot of our volatility is in small states exposed to the oil sector, which had some price changes at this point. But yeah, in the US, more Zika, fewer babies, that's kind of a question mark there. I can't really prove my point in the US. To prove my point, I need to go to Brazil. So here I have all Brazilian states, all US states, and Puerto Rico mapped out by their the number of Zika per 100,000 people and the change in births 9 months after Zika. And again, I want to just point out again, Puerto Rico's Zika density is higher than any state in Brazil during the peak of the Zika crisis. That is not something I had known. But what we see, and of course it's worth noting, Puerto Rico's total fertility rate today is just about 1 child per woman. But what I want to point out is here we have much more points in our negative correlation survives, right? We definitely have noise back here at the low end. But when we get out to these more severely hit regions, we do seem to see that areas hit harder by Zika had fewer births. And there's a lot of academic research looking at this in even more detail, looking more scientifically at Zika susceptibility by region and showing a very strong effect of Zika on fertility. So Zika caused less babies. But what about the other big epidemic scare? Remember when everybody was afraid of Ebola? That turned out to be nothing. Wrong. So here's fertility in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone around Ebola. I'm dating the beginning of the epidemic by the beginning of documented cases, but there's a pretty good argument that actually the epidemic began a few months before. So of course, Ebola caused a lot of mortality, and it wasn't as age biased as COVID. So you have a lot of reproductive age women who are getting sick or dying, or people around them are. So you see a pretty immediate decline in fertility. But then, of course, the major decline in fertility comes 7 to 10 months after the epidemic begins. Exactly what we would expect. But then in the long run, fertility recovered in West Africa. In fact, more than recovered. It ends up quite high, right? So this is an interesting case where actually here I have all the regions of Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea charted out. The x-axis is Ebola cases, is the density of Ebola cases. The y-axis is change in births 8 to 36 months after the end of Ebola, the average over that window. And what you can see is that actually in the long run, places hit harder by Ebola had more births. So this is a case where in the short run, Ebola reduced fertility, but in the long run, recuperative fertility, mortality replacement fertility occurred. Places hit harder had more babies. This is also observed after the 2004 tsunami in Indonesia, by the way. Places hit harder, they had fewer births 9 months later, but they did have more births in the long run. We've actually observed this at least with Hispanic and Black women in New Orleans after Katrina as well. We observe this particularly in religious societies or in societies with more traditional fertility perspectives, that a lot of death leads to more birth. But in more secular societies or societies with more egalitarian gender values, we don't observe as much recuperative fertility. So, Ebola radically altered fertility in West Africa. Well, okay. But what about the most similar case, SARS in Hong Kong? Well, it altered fertility in the way we'd expect to. I should mention, SARS was very traumatic for Hong Kong, but the total amount of deaths caused barely show up in a graph of mortality for Hong Kong. It's a blip. It's not a big mortality effect. And yet births fell below seasonal trend by almost 30%. And calculating seasonal trend in Hong Kong is a bit challenging because we deal with the 12-month season and we also deal with the lunar calendar. So this is accounting for auspicious and inauspicious months and years for childbearing. So I'm accounting for both calendars here. And what we can see is about 9 months after the beginning of SARS, there's a huge decline in fertility in Hong Kong. Even though there were not that many deaths, because what happened is Hong Kong people hunkered down and didn't have babies. Being bunkered down for a disease doesn't make you have babies. Now, we do have some cases where there were events where people hunkered down and didn't, but there wasn't a lot of death. So this is sort of just your pure quarantine effect. So the Colombian power outage in the 1990s led to more babies afterwards. The Tanzanian power outage in the 2000s also led to more babies. The 1965 Northeastern power outage, academic research suggested it led to no change in fertility. There's a lot of urban myths about it leading to fertility, but the academic research suggests it didn't do a lot. However, mild US weather advisories do lead to more babies. The key thing about mild weather advisories is they tend to lead to evening activities being canceled, right? Like you cancel whatever you're gonna go and do gets canceled because of weather, but they tend to not destroy a lot of housing or kill a lot of people. So this is like a pure quarantine effect. On the other hand, severe weather advisories do tend to lead to destroyed property and lost lives. And so severe weather advisories tend to lead to less babies. Again, this is me summarizing a lot of academic research on this. So what we can see is that there is actually a positive quarantine effect. If you're quarantined with other people and there's not a lot of death, it probably is pronatal. But if you're getting death or economic loss, that swamps the quarantine effect. The quarantine effect is quite small. So the question is, what is COVID? Is COVID just a quarantine effect or is it a high mortality event? Oops. So the rule of thumb that I have, people dying is a bad thing. I know this is gonna be very shocking, right? But death, bad. It doesn't yield more babies. Even if people are stuck together, high amounts of death are not going to lead to more babies. So then we have to look at likely COVID mortality. So here I've charted out a few states. This is New York. This is regular seasonal mortality by weeks. And then these lines, this lower red line is if flattening the curve works pretty well in New York. So if we do a good job of flattening the curve in New York over the next few weeks, or rather if we have done a good job over the last few weeks because deaths are delayed, this red line, this higher dark red line, is if not so good a job of flattening the curve is done. This red line is approximately consistent with CDC's 150,000 death scenario. This is more like a 300 to 400,000 death scenario around the country. We can also look in Michigan. Here's what Michigan is looking at. It's a very large spike in death. Here's Louisiana. It's a very large spike in death. Now, some states aren't going to have a big spike. Some states, they'll bunker down and there won't be a big spike in death. And in those states, you might see a little bit of a boom. But when we're talking about hundreds of thousands of deaths, the median state experience is going to be elevated death. And hundreds of thousands of death will mean millions of cases. Millions of cases means a lot of people running fevers, not having sex. COVID is not just a coronacation. And I can't emphasize this enough. The experience of people like me, that is relatively young, educated people whose job is to think and write, and especially to think and write online. For us, COVID has been pretty easy. You quarantine, hey, people are all cooped up, wonder what they're going to do. But that is not the reality for most Americans. Early data suggests that death rates are much higher among Hispanics and African Americans. Lots of people are out of work. We have an enormous amount of unemployment. The median experience of COVID is going to be loved ones or yourself sick or dying, and you or people you know out of work. This is not a coronacation. Presenting this as, people are just going to hang out at home and have a good time is I can hardly emphasize enough how absurdly privileged of a perspective I think that this is. I'm influenced in this partly by, I currently live in Asia. The news on the ongoing starvation in the Philippines is of course very prevalent to us here. The same is happening in Ecuador, in India. The shortages you've seen in the US for a few weeks are nothing compared to what much of the world is going to experience. And I would urge you to consider COVID not as, oh, we just need to quarantine and hang out at home, but a lot of people are going to die. The debate is somewhere between, is it going to be as good as 50,000 or as bad as 3 million? Okay, so there's not going to be a COVID baby boom. It's not going to happen. In the long run, there could be social changes that alter family behavior. You could see more resilient marriages. You could see a shift to teleworking. In the long run, there's a lot of social changes that I can't really predict. But the direct epidemiological effect in this sort of 7 to 11 month window, less babies. That's what's going to happen. So I can now take questions. And the way that I want to do this is, let me bring up my meeting controls here. Is I would like, stop the share. I'd like you to, if you have a question, let's see, how many people do we have on here presently? I guess 50 something, right? I think that's too many to sort of sort out individual people and unmute you. So if you have a question, what I'd like you to do is you can just message it to everyone in the chat box. And I will answer it verbally. If you want to refer to a specific slide, I will go to it. And so that's how we'll do questions. Okay, first question. Isn't Zika an anomaly on this topic also due to the effects it has on unborn babies? Yes, Zika is absolutely an anomaly. Sorry, that was from Katie Francisco. Thank you for the question, Katie. Zika is an anomaly. Zika didn't cause deaths, but it caused a lot of fertility response. So I present that just as sort of another case in point that epidemic events can matter. But yeah, it's very different because it had a very specific fertility effect, and it didn't cause a lot of deaths. I should mention though that all known severe coronaviruses, SARS, MERS, and COVID, have been shown to have lead to increased rates of adverse pregnancy outcomes. We haven't advertised that effect because the mortality effect is so much bigger, but there are adverse pregnancy outcomes associated with being infected with COVID, at least with a symptomatic case. We don't know for sure of an asymptomatic case, but at least a symptomatic case, there are adverse outcomes associated with that. So, you know, I think as people become aware of that, and I think they will eventually become aware of that, I think that has to impact fertility decision-making. Forgive me if I'm going to mispronounce this name, but Gellert Dornay asks, your data certainly shows births dropping 9 months after the traumatic events, but many recover soon after that. Are current policies leading to support a longer-term recovery in the US? The US has passed an enormous stimulus, $2 trillion, and the Federal Reserve has acted very aggressively too. That's great. I'm trained as an economist. However, I'm not trained as a macroeconomist. So forecasting recessions and business cycles is sort of a different business. I'm pleased that the US has taken action. yeah, I'm pleased that the US has taken action. I hope it's a quick recovery. China's recovery coming off lockdown has been slower than most analysts hoped for. So I think we should not assume that this is going to be a quick V-shaped recovery. I don't think it's going to be one of these super slow, long slogs. I think it'll be reasonably quick compared to the severity, but I don't think we should assume that we're going to come out of lockdown and it's just going to go back to normal. Miriam asks, what about European countries that are on strict lockdown, but only up to 10 deaths so far? So not many deaths, but weeks-long quarantine. Can this be a scenario for baby boom? Thank you for the question, Miriam. In the case where you have a quarantine and not many deaths, it is possible that you could get a baby boom. There's a famous paper looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis that found that people who lived within missile range of Cuba or close to military bases had more babies after the Cuban Missile Crisis. The argument being that existential insecurity, a sense, we might die, led to more babies. It is possible that in countries that go into a hard lockdown but don't have deaths could have more babies. However, they're still going to experience massive economic disruptions. And the unemployment that comes with this may be even more antinatal than the catastrophe itself. That is, in terms of births, the economic effect may be the big effect. Okay, we have a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to take these briefly. Brett, I'm going to mispronounce this. Brett Singbush asks, have you looked at the effect of 9/11 on births as a different reference point? There is a paper that looks at 9/11 by an academic named Matt Ruther. He's a demographer. He finds that 9/11 had a very modest effect, increasing births in Manhattan and nowhere else, which is a really strange finding because we would have expected the opposite, that it would reduce births in Manhattan and increase them elsewhere. So I don't really have a good explanation for that. It's possible terrorist attacks are different. There's also a famous study of the Oklahoma City bombing that found that it was pronatal in places that were where it was very salient as an issue. So it's possible that terrorist attacks have a unique impact. We have an Irish name that I'm going to butcher. Darbale in Dublin asks, do issues such as childcare support in times of catastrophes affect rates? Most places have canceled childcare and daycare and things like that. So if anything, I would think that if your system normally depends on a lot of childcare outside the home, that you may have a worse fertility impact than other places because it's a bigger shock. Whereas if you're in a society where the norm is that a parent stays home to take care of children anyways, this is not so disruptive. In fact, the Pew Research Center just put out a study. They ran a poll last week, 2 weeks ago, that they published today or yesterday, showing that for 2/3 of American families, they report that dealing with childcare has been very or somewhat easy. The vast majority of American families that have kids at home have not found it difficult to deal with childcare. I'm just going to leave that one unquestioned. I know people don't believe that. I find it hard to believe as well, but it's what the survey said. So there you go. Tyler Smith asks, do you expect to see different birth rate impacts based on levels of household income? Should we expect lower household income or unemployment driving even lower birth rates overall for those in that category? I would think that people whose experience of COVID is they shift to teleworking, that might be pronatal. There's research out of Germany showing that DSL expansion led to more births among higher educated women because they did more working from home. So working from home is pronatal. So for people who COVID leads to them having a durable work from home option, it could be pronatal. For working class people who are never going to have a work from home option because they're service workers on the front line somewhere, it could be more antinatal. So yes, there could be a socioeconomic bias. A person who is listed as Crodell.ad asks, in the average chart where the red line showed births down starting at month 2, why? You mentioned adverse effects. Anything else? There's several reasons. One is my sample included some hurricanes where there's a migration effect. That is, part of it is just people leaving the region. It's not, maybe they had the births elsewhere. So that's a bit of a bias in the data. But then yes, it's also adverse effects. It's miscarriage. It could also be mistiming of crises. You know, by the time we get data about something, it's always likely that the crisis has been going for a little while before that. So it's possible that the crisis began a month or two earlier than what I'm able to track. Evan Christopher asks, based on your discussion of mortality replacement fertility further on down the road, is it correct that you're not expecting a large mortality replacement boom in the US? Yeah, I don't expect a large mortality replacement boom. I don't expect most Americans to have that sort of, wow, there was so much death, we have to make life reaction. That tends to be something we observe among I guess we could say more traditional populations. Now, the US is much more religious than most developed countries, particularly because of higher degrees of religiosity among Hispanics and African Americans, who are also likely to be the hardest hit by COVID. So, so that could, and also because COVID kills older people at much higher rates, older people tend to be more religious, more involved in religious communities. So religious communities are more likely to be exposed to COVID mortality. So it could be that COVID mortality is concentrated in religious communities and they respond with recuperative fertility. But yeah, I wouldn't bet on that. This is something we usually see in more commonly in developing countries. Shmuel M asks, does Israel follow this trend of less babies after disaster? I don't know. If, you know, I guess there have been a lot of high mortality events I could look at in Israel's history. So I will look at that. I don't know. That's a good question. Darbale McDonald is testing my pronunciation of the name again, but asks, lots of key workers are being offered supports in Europe despite lockdowns. I assume that refers to childcare. Derval, it's pronounced Derval. I'm so sorry. So yeah, it's possible that people receiving childcare could have less disruption. That's entirely possible. Eric, do you know of any historical instances where governments incent births after a catastrophe? Do I know of any historical instances where governments incent births after a catastrophe? No, I don't know. I'm assuming that this means like specifically trying to trigger, like implement a pronatal policy immediately after a disaster. I don't know. If I had to guess, I would bet that that Hungary will do this, just because they probably will. We have 15 more minutes. Here we go. Ooh, another name test. Harlaus asks, would you expect abortions to decrease at the same rate that births will probably decrease due to COVID-19? This is a good question. My expectation, well, okay, so there's demand for abortions is likely to rise during COVID-19. Demand for abortions. However, a lot of states are ruling abortion clinics to be non-essential, and they're shutting them down for the duration of COVID, which obviously will reduce abortion rates. How these two things balance out, demand for abortions versus access to abortions, is anybody's guess. I'm hoping that there will, I'm hoping to receive some survey data on that in the near future, as I'm in the process of putting together a survey of COVID's impact on fertility preferences. And this is we're specifically asking this question about abortion demand. Jonathan Williams, who has a famous name, asks, why will demand increase for abortion? Why will demand increase for abortion? Anytime that fertility preferences fall, abortion demand rises. It's that simple. So if people see the future as very uncertain, they're more likely, if their economic situation is very poor, they're more likely to get abortions. There's a very good study looking at changes in alimony laws, that is exploiting places where states radically alter their alimony laws. And they find that when you force men to pay more alimony, abortion rates decline sharply. That is, women's economic conditions are a significant driver of abortion decisions. A lot of abortions are not because the child was unwanted in some inherent sense. It is because the child was wanted but unaffordable, which is one of the great tragedies of abortion. One of the many. Sorry for the small op-ed there, but all that to say, dire financial circumstances are likely to increase demand for abortion, although of course reduced access could offset that. Rosemary Palladini asks, how do you account for incorporating recession impacts along with the pandemic impact? So will there really be a rise 17 to 20 months later when you incorporate recession on top of this? Excellent question. I'm implicitly assuming not a V-shaped recovery, but a reasonably quick one. But if actually we have another recession that takes a long, slow recovery, then there will absolutely be no recovery in birth 17 to 23 months from now. We'd just be down, 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 down. So I am assuming that we might not have a V-shaped recovery, but I am assuming that we will have a quick recovery, relatively speaking. But if that's not true, then you can just expect durably lower fertility. We could see total fertility rates fall. I mean, I don't want to be too dire and speculative, but to 1.5 children per woman within a few years, 1.4. Right now we're at 1.7, which is an all-time low. Shmuel asks, did the ubiquity of the internet increase the impact of birth after disaster? I'm not totally sure what that means. Maybe the question can be clarified. I can talk a little bit about the role of media exposure in fertility. There's a couple of studies looking at different forms of media exposure around the world. Soap operas in Brazil, 16 and Pregnant in the US, entertainment television in Pakistan, TV viewership generally around the world. And it pretty much universally finds that more media consumption is associated with lower births. But these are mostly long run studies. They're not so much like just discrete events. Does the internet reduce births? I mean, I don't know. There's a lot of questions about like Netflix and chill. Are people Netflixing and just chilling? There's questions about smartphones. It's difficult to say. It certainly would be consistent with what we know about like TV viewership. If internet access would have some antenatal impact, but it hasn't been demonstrated yet. So we can really only speculate at this point. Oh, clarifying the question, Shmuel says, does more information about the disaster might lead to more people not having babies? It's possible. Exposure to fear could impact. So, but this is getting into the psychology question. And again, the psychological impact of exposure to death tends to be pronatal. That is, people go, we're going to die anyway. Let's do it like it's the end of the world, baby. But it's possible that more information about economic impacts and how bad it's going to get, expectational things could have a negative impact. But it's very difficult to say. That psychological part of the question is inherently one of the most difficult parts to answer. Luckily, the economic effects and the mortality effects are so large that they're going to swamp the sort of the psychosocial effect. We have 9 more minutes because I'm moving at warp speed here. Terribly sorry if I've just left anyone terribly confused because of the speed. I just wanted to make sure we had plenty of time for questions and covered everything. Evan Christopher asks, broad question, maybe hard to answer, but any impact from the introduction of modern contraceptives and the reduction in accidental pregnancy? Yes. Modern mortality events have tended to have attenuated effects. So modern mortality events don't time series of births are just more volatile now than in the past for many reasons. But yeah, it does seem that in modern times, which is plausibly due to contraception, that the fertility decline after mortality events is relatively attenuated. It's not quite as strong. However, it's still there, even in quite recent disasters. Like, I mean, I showed you very recent disasters. You know, Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Katrina, the 2009 Samoa, recent flu seasons in the US. So the effects are attenuated. They're not as big as they used to be, but they are still there. Dennis Griffith asks, how much does housing costs impact recovery? Unlike in a big natural disaster, we could see falling rents in some of the most expensive urban areas. It's a great question. Falling rents are good for fertility. There's a lot of evidence suggesting that housing costs are one of the major barriers to families having the number of children that they want. However, falling rents are mostly going to be indicative of serious economic losses in an area. That is, it's not like, I mean, if rents fall in cities, it's because a lot of people left, and a lot of people left, it means a lot of businesses in the area are also going to struggle. So I don't think that the rent effect is going to offset the economic effect, of which it is simply a symptom. Derval asks, fertility trends have been declining in many developed countries. Is now a time to place fertility into the pandemic discussion mix? Yeah, I mean, I think that the severe fertility decline that most developed countries have been experiencing since 2008 and 2009, it has been severe and quite unpredicted, makes this question even more pressing. Many countries are already dealing with critically low birth rates that will have severe consequences for their future. Throwing a pandemic into the mix makes it even worse. It's going to mean that countries after this are going to be even more concerned about this issue, and there's going to be even higher demand for frankly, for pronatal policies. A lot of countries are going to be saying, wow, we really need to get on this. David Iglesias asks, what about countries with exceptionally low birth rates like Japan? Will there be any difference in projected birth rates? No, I would expect that countries with low birth rates, when they get hit by a disaster, they'll fall again. Note that I actually had a recent example from Japan in the 2011 Fukushima disaster. We don't have, and also, of course, SARS in Hong Kong is in a low fertility society. So no, I would expect low fertility societies would behave exactly the same. Joy Gentis asks, do years of presidential elections have effects on birth rates? Could this be another added layer of lower birth rates in the US this year? There is a winner effect of presidential elections. Whoever wins, their people in their party tend to have slightly more births. However, the effect is very, very small. So I don't think it's really important to include in our calculations. Oops, I skipped one. Crodil.ad asks, can death or birth learnings from 1918 apply today? Well, I included a very large number of data points from 1918. So my answer is yes, I think they can, because it's a high mortality event. But I've also included a lot of other flu pandemics in there. I've got the 1957, 1951, 1949, 1929, 1968. I've got flu pandemics out the wazoo in here. All your flu pandemics are in my data set somewhere. Miriam asks, what is your explanation for demographic winter in the most of the developed world? What is your explanation for that? What is the remedy? I just wrote an article. Well, yeah, I'm sorry, Miriam. I'm going to have to skip that question. It's a great question. I've written an extensive amount about it in various places. Many barrels of ink have I shed on this topic. Unfortunately, it's a great topic for a webinar on another day. But if you all would like to hear a webinar on that, you should email IFS and tell them, hey, you should have Lyman do a webinar on that. Okay, Catherine, I've interacted with you several times, so I should be able to pronounce your last name, but I'm going to go with Pakaluk. What's your hunch? Do you expect the magnitude of this shock to attenuate the demographic differences between religious and secular fertility behavior or reduce them? If anything, I would expect that disaster events tend to heighten differences. Extreme events don't tend to make people more similar. They tend to sort of have us fall back on our sort of deep models of behavior. So I would say that more likely we will see more religious and more secular people have different responses. Now, I mean, there's going to be some degree of similarity, but to the extent we would expect a change in the relationship between them, I would expect the gap to grow. I have 3 more minutes. I can take maybe one more question. Jonathan Williams asks, what sort of policy levers could governments feasibly exercise during this time in order to offset the antenatal impacts of this pandemic that you have been outlining? Child allowances. There's no reason to get fancy with pronatal policy. People are always trying fancy things. Do this special program, do this unique thing, have an ad campaign encouraging men to do laundry, do this special loan program for housing. Just don't bother with it. Just give families money. The closer you can get to just giving families money, the better your fertility impact is going to be. Poland has had great success with their 500 plus program. Latvia and Lithuania have had good success. A really nice paper out of the UK showed that the UK's better fertility response during the Great Recession was due to some specific mortgage related relief that basically they kind of accidentally dumped a ton of money into families' pockets pretty directly. Yeah, I mean, just give money to families directly. Either do it directly through just cash payments per kid, or do it through giving like a housing allowance. Like every family will be given some amount of housing money or something. But just give people money. There's great research on this. I just wrote an article a month ago reviewing all the literature on this. We've got dozens and dozens of papers, and the consensus is pretty clear. Giving people money makes more babies. And on that, I'm going to have to call time here. I want to give everyone a chance to get home to their families. I know you're not seeing your family enough these days, right? And you just really want to get off this exciting webinar and go see them some more. However, it's 1 a.m. in Hong Kong, so I do need to hit the sack. Thank you all so much for coming on. I can see about circulating this presentation to people who are interested. Yeah, that's a wrap. I'm going to end the meeting. Oh, and I should say thank you to the people who made this happen, Institute for Family Studies and Demographic Intelligence for making it possible for me to do this kind of work.